The trap of virtual discipline. Why do you always fail on Tuesdays? Have you ever made a perfect study plan on Sunday night, full of hope, only to see it crumble on Tuesday? Perhaps you told yourself, this week will definitely be different. You set your desk, set phone reminders, prepared everything like a warrior. But when the clock struck midnight, you picked up your phone. A video became 10, an hour became 3. And when you looked up, it was already midnight. You're not lazy, nor are you stupid. You're just stuck in a pattern no one has taught you how to break free from. This is the story of Elias, a 20-year-old student who is intelligent, but constantly teetering on the brink of failure. Elias doesn't lack potential. What he lacks is an understanding of the true nature of discipline. He lives in a painful gap between the person he imagines and the person he truly is every day. One late night at the library, a chance encounter with the elderly librarian, Warwick, changed everything. He didn't teach Elias about miraculous study methods, but about a rope woven from 1,000 thin threads. Warwick saw through Elias's bewildered eyes and spoke a harsh truth. Discipline isn't a feeling or motivation. It's a silent structure you must build, even when you least want to. Don't leave. Because if you're also tired of having to start over every week, Warwick's secret of the 3 threads is the most important lesson you're about to hear in your student life. Let's find out how Elias bridged that gap. Elias was the kind of student people described with a strange mix of praise and doubt. He's smart, they would say, but not consistent. It was the same sentence his high school teachers had used, the same quiet observation that followed him into university. On paper, he had potential. His entrance scores were solid, his understanding quick, his ideas sharp when he actually focused. But focus was the problem. By his second year, Elias had fallen into a pattern so familiar it almost felt normal. Every Sunday night, without fail, he would sit at his desk and design a new plan. His notebook was filled with them carefully structured schedules, color-coded subjects, detailed daily goals written in neat, controlled handwriting. Each plan looked like it belonged to a top student, someone disciplined, someone in control, and every time, he believed it. This week will be different, he would tell himself. Monday would start strong. He would follow the schedule, complete a few tasks, feel a small sense of progress. But by Tuesday, something would shift. A small delay, a short break that lasted too long, a quick check of his phone that turned into an hour. By Wednesday, the plan was already slipping. By Friday, it was gone. Then Sunday would come again, bringing with it a fresh wave of motivation. And another, new plan. It wasn't laziness. Elias wasn't avoiding work because he didn't care. In fact, he cared too much. He thought about his future constantly. He imagined success, stability, pride. But thinking and doing had become 2 completely separate worlds. And without realizing it, Elias had built a cycle, a loop of planning, failing, restarting, over and over again. A loop that felt productive, but led nowhere. There was a version of Elias that only existed in his imagination, a version of himself who woke up with clarity, sat down without hesitation, and worked without needing to fight his own mind. That version of him didn't scroll endlessly, didn't delay, didn't bargain with time. He simply did what needed to be done. And the strange part was, Elias could see him so clearly. But every day, reality told a different story. In real life, Elias hesitated. He opened his books, then closed them again. He told himself he would start in 5 minutes, then 10, then tomorrow. And each small delay created a quiet crack between who he believed he could become and who he was actually becoming. That gap began to grow. At first, it was small enough to ignore. A missed study session, a rushed assignment, a promise to do better next week. But over time, those moments stacked on top of each other, forming something heavier, something harder to escape. It wasn't just about falling behind in class anymore. It was about losing trust in himself. Because deep down, Elias knew something uncomfortable. He wasn't failing because the material was too hard. He wasn't failing because he lacked intelligence. He was failing because he couldn't rely on himself to follow through. And that realization is one of the heaviest feelings a person can carry. Not anger, not even sadness, but a quiet, persistent disappointment that follows you through the day, reminding you that you are capable of more, yet somehow unable to prove it. The most dangerous part of this gap is not the distance itself. It's how normal it starts to feel. The collapse didn't come with noise. There was no dramatic failure, no moment where everything suddenly fell apart. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost politely, like it had been expected all along. It was the midterm exam for economics, a subject Elias believed he understood. He had attended most of the lectures. He had the slides, the notes, the key concepts highlighted. 4 days before the exam, he finally sat down to study, telling himself it would be enough. But 4 days of anxious, distracted effort is not the same as 4 weeks of steady practice. When Elias walked into the exam room, nothing felt unusual at first. The same chairs, the same silence, the same ticking clock on the wall. But the moment he looked at the first question, something shifted. He recognized the topic. He had seen it before. He knew he had read about it. But recognition is not mastery. The words didn't come together. The structure wasn't there. The confidence he needed to explain the answer clearly was missing. His mind felt scattered, like pieces that had never truly been connected. He stared at the page longer than he should have. Then he moved on. Then again. 2 questions were left almost completely blank. 2 weeks later, the results came back. He had passed, barely. His score placed him near the bottom quarter of the class. There was no shock this time, just a quiet confirmation of what he already knew. An email followed shortly after. Formal, polite, distant. Please reconsider your study habits before the final exams. Elias stared at the message for a long time. Not angry, not surprised, just tired. That night, Elias didn't go to the library to study. He went there because he didn't know where else to go. The campus was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that makes you more aware of your own thoughts. He found a seat near the back, surrounded by rows of students who seemed different, not smarter, not more intense, just steady. They weren't rushing, weren't panicking. They simply sat there, turning pages, writing notes, moving forward, one small step at a time. Elias watched them for a while. Some had been there when he arrived. Hours later, they were still there. Not exhausted, not distracted, just consistent. And for the first time, he began to wonder if consistency itself was the thing he had been missing all along. He didn't open his books. He just sat there, staring at the desk, caught somewhere between frustration and quiet curiosity. Long night? The voice came from beside him. Elias looked up, slightly startled. An older man stood there, holding a cup of water. His posture was relaxed, his expression calm, like someone who had seen this moment many times before. "I guess," Elias replied. The man set the cup down gently. "Exam results?" he asked. Elias hesitated. "How did you know?" A faint smile appeared. "I've worked in this library for over 20 years, the man said. I recognize that look. There was something disarming about him. No pressure, no judgment. Just a quiet presence that made it easier to speak honestly. And so Elias did. He talked about the plans, the failed routines, the constant restarting. He spoke about the gap between who he wanted to be and who he actually was. Words he had never said out loud suddenly came easily. The man listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, the silence returned, but it felt different now. Not empty, not heavy, just still. Then the man reached for a nearby shelf, pulled out a thin, worn notebook, and placed it on the table. "Take a look at this," he said quietly. Elias leaned closer to the notebook, his fingers hesitating for a moment before turning the first page. The writing inside was small, precise, almost mechanical. Each entry was dated. Each line was simple. "Read for 30 minutes. Finish chapter 1. He flipped to the next page. Read for 30 minutes. Chapter 2. Another page. The same pattern. Then another. And another. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into years. There were no dramatic notes. No long reflections. No bursts of inspiration written in emotional language. Just quiet, repetitive actions, recorded with almost stubborn consistency. Elias frowned slightly. "This is it?" he asked. The old man nodded. "Keep going." Elias flipped further ahead. The entries didn't change. No matter how far he went, the structure remained the same. Small effort. Completed. Repeated. "That notebook," the man said softly, "covers more than 20 years. Elias paused. 20 years? Of this? The man rested his hand lightly on the table. "Let me tell you something most people misunderstand," he said. "A ship is not held in place by a single, unbreakable chain. It's held by a rope." End quote. Elias looked up, confused. A rope made of hundreds, sometimes thousands of thin threads twisted together. The man continued. "Each thread on its own is weak. You could snap it with your fingers, but together, they can hold something massive in place." He tapped gently on the notebook. "Discipline works the same way." Elias felt something shift, not a sudden realization, but a slow, uncomfortable clarity. "It's not a feeling," the man said. "It's not motivation. It's not even your plan." He leaned slightly closer. "It's the rope you build. One thread at a time. One action at a time. One day at a time." Elias looked back at the pages, now seeing them differently. "And every time you skip a day," the man added quietly, "you don't lose everything, but you do untwist a thread." The room felt still again. "But skip enough days," he let the sentence hang, "and eventually, you're back to holding nothing at all." Elias kept his eyes on the notebook, but his mind was already racing ahead. If discipline was a rope, if it was built slowly over time, then how exactly do you start building it? As if he could hear the question forming, the old man reached for a blank piece of paper. "Most people fail," he said calmly, "because they make discipline too complicated." He picked up a pen and wrote the first line. "A fixed time." He slid the paper slightly toward Elias. "You don't study when you feel ready," he continued. "You study at the same time every day. Not flexible. Not negotiable. The brain adapts to repetition, not intention. If you sit down at 7 every evening, eventually, 7 becomes the signal, not motivation, not mood, just time." Elias nodded slowly. The man wrote the second line. "A small promise, kept exactly. Not 3 hours," he said. "Not as much as possible. That's where people lie to themselves. Start with something you cannot negotiate with. 45 minutes. 1 hour. And when that time is up, you stop." Elias frowned slightly. "Stop? Even if I can keep going?" The man gave a small nod. "Especially then. Because you're not building knowledge first. You're building trust. One small promise, kept every day, is stronger than 10 big promises you break." He wrote the third line. "Track the streak." Elias leaned closer. "After each session, mark it," the man said. "A simple check, a line on a calendar, something visible. You're not measuring how good the session was. You're measuring whether you showed up." He tapped the paper gently. "The longer the chain grows, the more you'll protect it. Not because you feel inspired, but because you don't want to break it." Elias looked at the 3 lines again. Simple. Almost too simple. "That's it?" he asked. The man met his eyes. "That's the structure," he said quietly. "Everything else comes later." Elias didn't walk out of the library with a new plan. That was the first difference. No colorful schedule. No long list of goals. No attempt to redesign his entire life overnight. Just a single decision, quiet and almost unimpressive on the surface. 7 o'clock, every evening, 1 hour. That was it. The first day felt ordinary, almost disappointingly so. There was no surge of motivation, no sense of transformation. He sat at his desk, opened his economics book, and began reading. His mind wandered a few times. He had to pull it back. Slowly, repeatedly. At 8 o'clock, he stopped. Not because he was tired. Not because he had finished everything, but because that was the rule. He took a pen and drew a small mark on a piece of paper taped to his wall. One mark. That night didn't feel like progress. It didn't feel like success. It just felt done. The second day was similar. So was the third. By the end of the first week, nothing dramatic had changed. He didn't feel smarter. He didn't feel more disciplined. If anything, he felt slightly uncomfortable, like he was forcing himself into something unnatural. But he kept going. Week 2 was harder in a different way. Not physically, not mentally, emotionally. One evening, as the clock approached 7, he heard laughter from the common room. His friends were watching something together. His phone lit up with messages, invitations, jokes, moments he knew he was about to miss. He paused, just for a second. Then he turned the phone face down, sat at his desk, and opened his book. He didn't feel strong. He didn't feel motivated. But he showed up, and that was the second thread. The resistance didn't disappear. If anything, it became more visible. Before, Elias used to drift through his days without noticing the moments where he avoided work. Now, those moments stood right in front of him, clear and undeniable. Every evening, as 7 o'clock approached, there was always something else pulling at him. A notification, a conversation, a sudden urge to rest, just for a few minutes. None of it felt dramatic. That was the dangerous part. It wasn't a battle against something big. It was a constant negotiation with small, harmless-looking distractions. And every one of them came with a quiet excuse. You can start later. You deserve a break. One day won't matter. Elias heard those thoughts clearly now. And for the first time, he didn't argue with them. He simply didn't follow them. 7 o'clock came. He sat down. Some days, his focus was sharp. Other days, it felt like pushing through fog. There were evenings where he read the same paragraph 3 times, without understanding it. Moments where the clock seemed to move slower than usual. But the rule didn't change. He stayed. That was the difference. Not intensity, not perfection, just presence. And slowly, something inside him began to shift. Not in a way he could celebrate, not in a way others could see, but in a way that mattered. Because every time he chose to sit down, instead of walking away, he tightened the rope. The change didn't arrive the way Elias expected. There was no sudden burst of clarity, no moment where everything clicked, no feeling of becoming a completely different person overnight. It was quieter than that. Around the 18th day, something subtle began to happen. At first, Elias didn't even notice it. He simply followed the routine as he had been doing 7 o'clock. Sit down, open the book, begin. But one evening, just before the hour came, he caught himself glancing at the clock, not with resistance, but with awareness. 7 o'clock was approaching. And instead of dreading it, he found himself preparing for it. Not excited, not motivated, just ready. That was new. The action no longer felt like a decision he had to fight for. It felt like something that belonged to his day, the same way eating or sleeping did. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't something he had to convince himself to do. It simply was. His roommate noticed it before he did. One evening, passing by his open door, Oliver paused for a moment and said, "You're always at your desk at 7 now." Elias looked up briefly. "Yeah," he replied, and then he went back to reading. That simple sentence carried more truth than anything he had said about himself before, because for the first time, Elias wasn't describing who he wanted to be. He was describing who he had become, not through motivation, not through a perfect plan, but through repetition. It happened in the 8th week, not because Elias lost focus, not because he stopped caring, but because life, as it always does, interrupted the structure he had built. His father fell slightly ill. Nothing serious, but enough to pull Elias away from campus for 2 days. 2 evenings, where 7 o'clock came and went, without him sitting at his desk. When he returned, everything looked the same. The room, the desk, the book. But something felt different. There was a gap. 2 empty spaces on the paper where his marks should have been. 2 missing threads in the rope he had been building so carefully. Elias stood there for a moment, staring at it longer than he expected. A familiar voice began to rise in his mind. "You've already broken it. Just start again next week. It doesn't matter anymore." He had heard those thoughts before. This was where he used to stop. This was where the cycle always restarted. But this time, he didn't move. He picked up the pen. Slowly, he drew 2 small lines, not to pretend those days had been completed, but to acknowledge them, to accept the break without letting it define what came next. Then he sat down, 7 o'clock, opened the book, and began. It wasn't perfect. The rhythm felt slightly off. His focus wasn't as sharp as before, but none of that mattered now. Because the real change wasn't in the streak. It was in the response. For the first time, Elias didn't let a mistake become an ending. He let it become a continuation. Final exams arrived without announcement. No dramatic countdown. No moment where Elias suddenly felt ready. In fact, as he walked into the exam room, the familiar tension was still there. The same quiet pressure. The same uncertainty. On the surface, nothing had changed. But something deeper had. He sat down, picked up the paper, and read the first question. This time, it was different. Not because the questions were easier, not because he had memorized everything perfectly, but because the knowledge was there. Not scattered, not fragile. It felt connected, like something that had been built piece by piece over time. He didn't hesitate as long. He didn't search blindly for words. He simply began writing, steadily, calmly, without rushing. For the first time, Elias wasn't trying to recall information at the last second. He was using something that had already become part of him. When the results came back, the change was clear. He wasn't at the top of the class. He wasn't suddenly exceptional, but he had moved into the top third. A real improvement, a measurable one, not built on luck, not driven by panic, but created through quiet, repeated effort. That night, he called his father. "How did it go?" his father asked, in the same careful tone as always. Elias paused for just a moment. "It went well," he said, and for the first time, it was true. My friend, Elias's story is not about becoming extraordinary. It's not about studying 10 hours a day. It's not about being perfect. And it's definitely not about waiting for the right moment to change. It's about something much simpler and much harder, showing up every single day, even when it feels boring, even when it feels pointless, even when nothing inside you wants to begin. Because here is the truth most people avoid. Motivation is unreliable. Feelings are temporary. But structure stays. Elias didn't change because he found a new plan. He changed because he stopped depending on how he felt and started depending on what he decided. That is the difference. The rope that holds everything together is real. 1 hour today is a thread. Tomorrow, another thread. Next week, 7 threads. And one day, without realizing it, you are holding something strong enough to carry your entire future. So here's where you begin. Choose one subject. Pick one fixed time. Start small and keep your promise. Don't negotiate with yourself. Don't wait to feel ready. Just show up. And if you miss a day, come back the next. No drama, no excuse. Just continue. Because your life doesn't change in one moment. It changes in the quiet decisions you repeat when no one is watching. Start today, and one day, you won't recognize the person you used to be.